Tonight, for the first time, police video showing what happened inside Gene Hackman's home.
Leah Chavez spent hours looking at the footage and shows us what they saw.
We got to figure out why and what, because everything was locked up. There was no signs of forced entry. There's obviously no initial signs of trauma.
On February 26, 2025, a maintenance worker and a security contractor walked up to a house outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, expecting a routine visit. What they found through the windows brought sheriff's deputies to the property within the hour, and what those deputies discovered inside would take investigators nearly 2 more weeks to fully explain. 2 people were dead. One of the couple's 3 dogs was dead with them, and nothing about the scene offered an easy answer for why. This is the true, documented account of what happened to Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, pieced together from autopsy findings, pacemaker data, phone records, and the statements New Mexico's chief medical investigator gave at a press conference roughly 2 weeks after the bodies were found. There is no tunnel, no hidden chamber, no conspiracy. What actually happened is stranger than that, and sadder, because it could happen to any family, in any home, given the wrong combination of bad luck. Santa Fe County Sheriff Adon Mendoza would later describe the scene his deputies walked into as one that immediately struck investigators as suspicious, language that ended up in the search warrant affidavit filed in the days that followed. Hackman's body was found near the entryway, in a mudroom close to the kitchen, with a cane and a pair of sunglasses on the floor nearby. Small details suggesting a man who had simply been upright one moment and was not the next. Arakawa was found on the other side of the home, on the floor of a bathroom near the front door, with an open prescription bottle and scattered pills on the countertop close to her. In a closet a few feet away sat the crate holding one of the couple's 3 dogs. Both bodies showed signs of decomposition consistent, investigators would later say, with having been there for an extended period. In Arakawa's case, mummification of the hands and feet, a process that typically doesn't begin until roughly 2 weeks after death, aided by Santa Fe's dry, high-elevation climate. Mendoza told NBC's Today Show 2 days after the discovery that he was pretty confident there had been no foul play, while stopping short of ruling it out entirely until toxicology and autopsy results were complete. That caution was well placed. It would take investigators nearly 2 more weeks of forensic work, autopsies, environmental testing, a search of the property, a review of both of their digital and communication records, before Chief Medical Investigator Dr. Heather Jarrell could stand at a podium and give the public an actual answer. To understand how this tragedy went unnoticed for so long, you have to understand how Gene Hackman chose to live after he stepped away from acting. Hackman won 2 Academy Awards across a career that produced some of the defining performances of American film in the 1970s and 80s, in films spanning multiple decades of American cinema. Then, in the early 2000s, he simply stopped. He gave up the premieres, the press circuit, the public version of himself, and moved into a private life in Santa Fe. He painted. He wrote novels, several of them historical fiction, co-written with a diving partner and novelist he'd befriended. He rode his bicycle around town, ate at the same handful of local restaurants, and largely let the town treat him like any other long-time resident rather than a 2-time Oscar winner living among them. For roughly 2 decades, an entire generation grew up knowing his movies without ever seeing a current photo of the man. Interviews became rare, then essentially non-existent. By most accounts from people who lived near him, that wasn't reluctant retirement. It was a life he'd actively chosen and seemed to genuinely prefer. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, was the center of that quiet life. Born in Hawaii, she trained as a classical pianist and studied at the University of Southern California before meeting Hackman in the mid-1980s. She was 30 years younger than him, and as the decades passed, she became far more than his spouse. She managed the household, the appointments, the errands, the day-to-day logistics that kept their world functioning without ever needing to open itself up to outsiders. That mattered enormously, because by the final years of his life, Gene Hackman was living with advanced Alzheimer's disease. His brain, examined during the autopsy, showed the deep structural changes associated with the disease's later stages, not ordinary forgetfulness, but a mind that could no longer reliably connect cause to effect or recognize and respond to danger. Betsy wasn't just his wife by that point. She was the connective tissue between Gene and the outside world. Their home had no live-in staff and no interior security cameras, a detail the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office confirmed publicly. The gate around their property kept the world at a distance, and the world, respecting the boundaries the couple had spent 20 years establishing, largely stayed out. That arrangement gave them peace while they were both healthy. It became something far more dangerous the moment one of them could no longer function without the other. Investigators reconstructed Betsy Orokawa's final movements using phone records, email logs, credit card activity, and surveillance footage from the businesses she visited. The picture they built points to February 11, 2025, as her last day. It looked like an ordinary Tuesday. That morning she exchanged emails, apparently routine correspondence. In the afternoon she ran errands around Santa Fe, a visit connected to the couple's dogs, a stop at a farmer's market, a stop at CVS. A few days earlier, on February 9th, she had picked up one of their 3 dogs, a dog named Xena, from a veterinary hospital following a procedure, which is why that dog was being kept separately in a crate rather than moving freely through the house with the other 2. At 5:15 that evening, the access system for their gated community recorded her vehicle returning home. After that point, investigators found no further outgoing communication or activity from her, no emails, no calls, nothing. Chief Medical Investigator Dr. Heather Jarrell later told reporters that Orokawa's last known outgoing activity was that same day, and that this was the basis for concluding she likely died on or around February 11th. Jarrell was careful to note publicly that there is no exact scientific method to pin down a precise time of death. This is an estimate built from the available evidence. On February 26, there's a detail in the days just before that day that makes the timeline harder to sit with. To a house outside Santa Fe, on the investigation, New Mexico, Orokawa had reached out to a local medical concierge. What they found through the windows brought sheriff's deputies describing herself as congested and asking about and what those deputies discovered inside would take investigators nearly 2 more weeks to fully explain. The practice told her to come in so they could discuss it properly. 3 dogs an appointment was set, and nothing about the scene offered an easy answer to reach her went unanswered. Whatever was happening in her body, Gene Hackman, she seems to have sensed something was wrong and tried, pieced together from autopsy findings, pacemaker to get ahead of it. Phone records after the body was discovered. New Mexico's Dr. Jarrell announced the cause of gave at a press conference roughly 2 weeks after the bodies were found. Hantavirus is real, and in the American Southwest, it's a conspiracy. If read, what actually happened is stranger than that. It's carried primarily by rodents because it could happen to any family, and it doesn't spread person to person. Given the wrong combination of bad luck, become infected by inhaling airborne particles from Don Mendoza would later describe the scene as deputies walked into as one that immediately struck investigators as suspicious. Garage, language that ended up in the search warrant affidavit filed. An environmental assessment of the Hackman property was found by New Mexico State health officials close to the found signs of rodent activity and a pair of sunglasses on the floor nearby. On the property. Small the main house suggesting it was assessed as low risk, upright one moment and was not many well-kept homes in the region. Was found on the other side of the home, require the house on the floor of a bathroom near the front door. It only required with an open prescription somewhere on the scattered pills on the countertop. What makes hantavirus especially dangerous is how ordinary it looks at first. Holding one of the early symptoms mimics a flu almost exactly. Showed signs of decomposition consistent. Muscle investigators would later say chills with having been there for an extended period. Vomiting. In Orokawa's symptoms that would mummification of the hands and the internet for home remedies rather than doesn't begin until roughly 2 weeks after the window investigators found when they reviewed Orokawa's high elevation climate. Search activity in the told NBC's Today Show 2 days after the discovery symptoms that he was pretty confident there had been no breathing exercises while stopping short of ruling it out entirely until toxicology and autopsy results were complete. There is no evidence she ever suspected anything as rare as hantavirus, nearly 2 more and there would have been little reason to. Autopsies. The illness gives environmental testing signal that distinguishes it from a review of both of the digital and communication without much warning. Before Chief Medical Investigator second and far more dangerous phase, podium as the lungs begin to fill with fluid. To understand the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention so long. This progression to understand how Gene Hackman chose to live after he stepped away from acting. Sometimes within a day or 2 Academy Awards across a career that produced some of the defining performances of the same press conference in the 1970s and 80s. Roughly 136 in films spanning multiple decades of American cinema. Previous 50 years, in the fatality rate cited at around 42%. He nearly up the premiere once the illness becomes symptomatic. The public version of himself, and moved into a private life in Santa Fe. And by the time it turned serious, there is often very little time left to historical fiction, even with treatment, co-written with a diving partner what investigators found and didn't find. He rode his bicycle around town, the open pill bottle the same handful of local restaurants, which fueled early speculation. Let the town turned out to be a prescribed long-time resident rather than a two-time Oscar winner living among them. Officials said they don't believe it played any role. An entire generation grew up knowing his tested negative without ever seeing a current photo of the gas company. Interviews became rare on the property. Then essentially non-existent. There was no forced entry. By most accounts from people who lived near trauma to either body. Wasn't reluctant retirement. Value in the home. It was a life he'd actively chosen and seemed to genuinely prefer. Had been touched. His wife, every scenario investigators was the center of that quiet life. Systematically born in Hawaii, which is part of why as a classical pianist and studied at the University of Southern California before meeting the second half in the mid-1980s. In some ways, she was 30 years younger than him. To sit with, and as the decades hinges on a piece of evidence most far more than investigations don't have access to. She managed the household, pacemaker, the appointments, Gene Hackman, the errands, the day-to-day, and the device had been quietly logging his heart's activity the entire time. Itself up to when investigators pulled the data, enormously. They found cardiac because by the final years of his life, Gene Hackman was living with advanced Alzheimer's disease, atrial fibrillation. His brain, examined during the autopsy, that was the last activity the device ever recorded with the disease's latest stages. Gerald told reporters it was reasonable to conclude that a mind that could no longer reliably connect caused roughly a week after his life and respond to danger. With that gap for a moment, wasn't just his wife. If the timeline investigators reconstructed the connective tissue between Gene and the outside world, 7 days inside their home had no living staff and no interior security cameras. In the detail, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office confirmed publicly the gate around their property kept summoning anyone who distance. His autopsy explained respecting the boundaries the couple had spent 20 years establishing, very extensive heart disease, including evidence of prior heart attacks and multiple past surgical procedures on his heart, along with damage to his kidneys tied to chronic high blood pressure. Examination of his brain confirmed the Alzheimer's disease using and blood vessel changes connected to long-term hypertension. The official cause of death was listed as hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's disease as a significant contributing factor. It looked like an ordinary negative for hantavirus. That morning she exchanged emails, never reached apparently routine. Investigators also noted that in the afternoon she ran errands around Santa Fe at the time of his death, a visit connected to the couple's in the period before he died. A farmer's market, though, notably, at CVS. He did not show signs of severe dehydration. On February 9th, it's a small detail, she had picked up one of but it says something. A dog in the fog of advanced Alzheimer's from a veterinary hospital, some instinct toward basic self-care, which is why that dog was being kept even as a larger instinct, rather than moving freely through the house to understand what had happened to the woman who ran his entire evening. The access system for the gated community that's recorded her vehicle returning home. The dog recovering in her investigators found no further outgoing communication or activity from her. No investigators determined she had most likely died of dehydration and starvation, unable to free herself and reach food or water on her own. Outgoing activity was that same day, and that this was the basis that dogs are not known to contract hantavirus, ruling out the illness as any factor in Zena's death. That there is no exact scientific method to pin down a precise time of death. This is an estimate built from the available and out of the house. One of them was found near Betts's body. The other was found outside. The difference between the dogs that lived and the one that didn't was simply the difference between being able to leave and not being able to. A small, almost unbearable echo of what happened to the humans in the house as well. It's worth pausing on what advanced Alzheimer's actually does to a person, because it's easy to underestimate from the outside. It isn't simply forgetting names or misplacing objects. In its later stages, the disease can erode a person's ability to initiate action at all, to recognize hunger, thirst, or danger as things requiring a response, even when some part of the brain still registers that something is wrong. A healthy person whose spouse doesn't wake up or doesn't come home moves almost automatically toward the phone, toward a neighbor's door, toward help. That chain of recognition, decision, and action is precisely what late-stage Alzheimer's disrupts. Gene Hackman had, by the time of his death, been living with an advanced form of the disease for long enough that his brain showed extensive structural changes on autopsy, not the kind of finding consistent with early or moderate impairment, but with a disease that had progressed a long way. The question that followed the release of these findings, the one nearly every article and every follow-up interview circled back to, is whether Gene Hackman understood, during those 7 days, that his wife had died. No one can answer that with certainty, and the medical investigator said as much directly when asked. But she and other physicians who spoke publicly about the case offered a perspective worth sitting with. Given how advanced his Alzheimer's was, it's entirely possible he was not able to process or retain what had happened around him. Late-stage Alzheimer's doesn't just erode memory. It can disconnect a person's feelings of distress from the ability to act on them. Someone in that stage of the disease can sense that something is wrong without being able to translate that feeling into the instinct a healthy mind would follow automatically. Call someone, seek a neighbor, ask for help. There's no evidence Hackman tried to contact anyone after Betts' death. No calls, no messages, nothing. The most plausible picture, based on everything investigators found, isn't of a man fully aware and grieving beside his wife's body for a week. It's closer to a man adrift, his sense of time and consequence already unraveling from the disease, moving through the rooms of a house that had suddenly gone silent, his heart finally giving out somewhere in that fog. Whether that reads as a small mercy or deeper tragedy probably depends on the person considering it. He may have been spared the full weight of understanding what had happened. He was also, in his final days, entirely alone in a way that's difficult to fully imagine. The question that followed close behind did he know was simpler and, in a way, more uncomfortable. How does this happen to anyone, let alone two people with money, resources, and public recognition? The answer investigators arrived at wasn't a cover-up or a failure of any single person. It was the natural, devastating result of the very privacy Hackman and Arakawa had built around themselves. He had spent 2 decades stepping back from public life, deliberately and successfully. No one expected him at events. No one was waiting on a call that didn't come. Long stretches of silence from the couple were, by design, completely normal. There were no interior security cameras and no live-in staff who might have noticed something amiss within a day or two, the way an employee arriving each morning would. The gated property and the couple's chosen isolation, which had given them exactly the private life they wanted for years, left no natural tripwire when something finally went wrong, and the timing compounded all of it. Betsy was the one who handled virtually every point of contact with the outside world, the calls, the appointments, the errands. When she died first, the household didn't just lose a person, it lost its only functioning link to anyone who might notice something was off. Gene, deep into Alzheimer's, could not step into that role. The one person capable of raising an alarm was gone, and the one person left in the house was not capable of raising one himself. So the days passed without anything looking obviously wrong from the outside, because nothing about a quiet, uncommunicative stretch was unusual for this particular couple. It wasn't until workers arrived at the property nearly 2 weeks after Betts' presumed death that anyone realized something had happened. Both deaths were ultimately ruled natural, with no evidence of foul play at any point in the investigation. The scattered pills, the separate rooms, the dead pet, every detail that looked ominous on February 26th had an explanation by the time investigators closed out their findings in mid-March, and none of those explanations involved another person. There were practical consequences that followed the medical ones. Reports on Hackman's estate indicated his will largely left everything to Betsy, built on the assumption that she would outlive him. Because she died first, by roughly a week, those plans were upended, and the matter moved into probate. Arakawa, for her part, had reportedly intended much of her own estate to go to charity. In the end, even questions of inheritance came down to the order of a handful of days. Court proceedings later determined how much of the investigative record, reports, photos, video, would be made public, with courts allowing broad release of documents while restricting direct depictions of the couple themselves, an attempt to balance public interest against what remained of their privacy even after death. That fight over records continued for months after the causes of death were announced, a reminder that even a case with a fully resolved medical explanation can leave behind a long tail of legal and administrative loose ends. That Hackman's family, his children and at least one granddaughter, spoke afterward mostly in terms that pushed back gently against the scale of the public fascination with the case. To them, the point wasn't the mystery or the medical detail, but that they had lost a father and grandfather, in addition to whatever the world had lost in an actor.